The ARK of James Carlyle by Cherry Wilder. A synonym used by Cherry Barbara Grimm, an acculturated Australian originally from New Zealand, when she began writing science fiction stories in 1974. This was her first story, originally published in Kenneth Bulmer's 1974 anthology, New Writings in SF number 24, which was republished the very next year. It appeared in an Australian anthology called Beyond Tomorrow in 1976, then in the January 1978 issue of Galileo magazine. From there on, it was nothing but further anthologies, which included Perilous Planets in 1978, which had 2 reissues in 1980, and Mortal Fire, Best Australian SF in 1993, read by Daryl T. Smith II from my channel, Quasar Spectra. The ARK of James Carlyle. On the 91st day of his Met duty, Carlyle stepped out of the hut and gazed desperately at the cloudless sky. There were no quags to meet him on the platform. The oily purple sea sucked gently at the wooden piles. His instruments had assured him there was a light westerly breeze. His delusion persisted, and he had nothing to support it, not even the tangible evidence of an aching bunion. He did not dare call the station. How would he begin? Something tells me... He decided to walk round the island, but he found an ancient quag, the one he called the chief, squatting at the foot of the ladder. He beckoned him onto the platform. The quags were cryptorchids, so for all he knew, perhaps this was a chieftainess. It was difficult to tell. When he had first taken up his duty, before the boat brought him to the island, he had seen Mary Long, a young anthropologist who had tagged along with the landing party to the plateau, sexing a herd of quags. She walked among them, picking the creatures up and solemnly examining their genital pouches. She was engrossed in her work. 20 or 30 surrounded her, and gently stripped off every stitch of her clothing before Carlyle or the other men could intervene. They sat round her and stared, their luminous eyes full of innocent curiosity. Not a great deal of work had been done on quags. They had been described as small land mammals, semi-erect bipeds, modified baboons. They were docile, certainly, and capable of performing many tasks, but they were also ugly, elusive, and rank-smelling. Their odor had already ceased to bother Carlyle, but he noticed that the quags still kept upwind of him. He found himself describing them differently. They were like trolls, like squatting goblins, like little old men. At night he listened for one of their rare sounds, the quack-quack-quack, hardly vocalized, that had given them their name. The chief, who was a big fellow, fully 3 feet tall, scrambled nimbly onto the platform. "Where are the others?" asked Carlyle. Every other day the platform had been lined with quags who gave him berries, limpets, burrowing shrimps in exchange for bacon cubes. He had tried them with everything he had, orange juice, vegetables, vitamins, but they liked the bacon best. Now the chief tried to explain their absence. He could be heard only by cupping his long, pluish hands before his tiny slit of a mouth to amplify the sound, the way Carlyle made owl hoot as a boy. "Meehaw!" boomed the chief faintly. At first Carlyle did not understand. The meehaw was a tree. In fact, it was the only tree. The vegetation on AC-14 was low, luxuriant, and undistinguished except for the meehaw trees, which reared up with straight trunk and spreading crown of leafy branches 100 meters and more above the bushy islands in the still purple sea. The timber, resembling balsa, was particularly easy to work. The platform on which Carlyle had his Met hut was made entirely of the single meehaw tree that had grown on the tiny island. The quags had wept to see it fall down. Carlyle had had the uneasy notion that the meehaw tree might be sacred to them. Now the chief pointed to the island. Carlyle was shaken again by his crazy premonition. "Come on," he said. He climbed down from the platform and followed the chief up the brush-covered slope. All the quags on the island, about 30 of them forming one family group, were huddled together on the broad stump of the meehaw tree. "Why?" asked Carlyle. "Why?" The chief cupped his hands and answered with a third quag word. Carlyle strained to catch it. "ARK?" The quags on the stump waved their fingers. This was a way of laughing. To Carlyle's surprise, they all began to vocalize, even the babies, pale blue and completely hairless, cupping their tiny hands. "ARK" was the nearest he could get to it. "What's that?" asked Carlyle. He already knew. He went into a mad pantomime, begging the quags for confirmation. Then he ran back to the Met hut. He called the satellite without a glance at his instruments. He announced firmly, "There's going to be a flood." The receiver crackled. What were his readings? "The quags told me." The crackle became indignant. "Reading, please." Carlyle turned hopelessly towards his instrument panel, and his heart pounded. The barometer had dropped an unbelievable 3 inches and was still falling. The wind had swung round to the south. The room became dark as he completed his report, and huge drops of rain began a tattoo on the roof of the Met hut. He ran out onto the platform. The sky was a dome of blue-black cloud above a darkening sea. The waves flashed emerald and purple-black and broke in iridescent foam upon the shore. The word for it, Carlyle decided, was unearthly. Already drenched to the skin, he cowered in the doorway of the hut. He was worried about the quags. He guessed that their instinct to seek higher ground would keep them huddled on the meehaw stump. The fragile shelters where they slept and did their weaving would be no protection against this rain. A picture of the quags twisting their endless ropes from native flax lingered in his mind. He wished, idly, that the meehaw tree had not been cut down. Carlyle gave a cry. "The tree!" He peered out into the downpour, staring up at the dark center of the island where the mighty meehaw tree had stood, ready to shelter the quags in its dense foliage. They made ropes, probably sent up a young male to loop slings over the branches. Then the whole tribe went up. There was a splashing and scrabbling at the foot of the platform. Carlyle knelt down and saw the chief, already swimming awkwardly. The water had risen 3 feet in 20 minutes. The rain was a blinding cataract. A man who lay on his back would drown, thought Carlyle. He dragged the old quag aboard and bundled him into the hut. They sat gasping, the water pouring from the quag's grizzled hide, from Carlyle's coveralls. "How far?" gasped Carlyle. "How high does the water—" He gestured with a horizontal hand, staring into the chief's bulging dark eyes. Carlyle was suddenly aware of an earlier moment. When the meehaw tree came down, the day the quags wept, he and Ensign Weiss noticed marks on its great trunk, a series of wavy bands, between 3 and 4 meters from the lowest branches, more than 80 meters from the ground. Carlyle understood with another thump of fear. Watermarks. The water would rise until only the meehaw tops rose like islands out of the purple sea. The only high ground on the entire planetoid was the plateau where his expedition had touched down briefly, far to the north. It had a large quag population and no meehaw trees. The chief touched Carlyle's knee gently with the tip of his prehensile tail. "Sure, Carlyle. Sure." We have a real problem here, old buddy. He was calculating. One life raft, inflatable, fully provisioned and powered, capacity 6 humans. All he had to do was launch the thing, and figure out some way of transporting 30 quags to the plateau. The receiver gave his call signal, but Carlyle paid no attention. He rushed out onto the platform again, into the deluge, and saw with alarm that the water was up to the cross supports. The scrap of beach and the lowest rank of undergrowth were already submerged. Sea and sky were joined in a blue-black curtain of moisture. Suddenly Carlyle gave a triumphant cry that brought the old quag scuttling to his side. He had realized that they were standing upon a raft. He explained it to the chief as he dug out the axe. The tribe must come aboard now, pronto. When the water rose, he would knock out the supports of the platform, and they would be launched. The wind and the current were driving towards the plateau. Maybe they could use the power pack of his own inflatable boat. "Come on," he shouted. "We have to get them aboard." The chief had been dancing and shivering at Carlyle's side, stretching out his arms to the island. He pointed through the rain, and Carlyle saw that the quags were coming. It made sense, of course. The platform was a little higher than the top of the island. They came swarming through the bushes and flung themselves gamely into the water. Their awkward quag paddle was very efficient. The first wave, pregnant females and mothers with babies on their backs, was already nosing towards the supports. The turbid water was alight with their bulbous eyes. Carlyle knelt down beside the chief and began to heave the dripping creatures aboard. More than once, Carlyle saw a big quag dive and drag up a half-drowned cub. The oldest animals took it pretty hard. They fought to stay on land, but the younger ones thrust them brutally into the water. All along the platform in the plunging rain, the rest of the tribe were gently dancing and stamping, reaching out their arms in encouragement to those still in the water. The chief and 4 husky offsiders watched him wallowing in water up to his neck and hammering with the back of the axe head at one of the supports. The Mehaw piles had been embedded in heavy silt to a depth of 2 meters. Carlyle reckoned he could slide the tops of the piles out of the groove cut for them in the platform. But the first pile moved inward with a lurch the moment he hit it. He saw that the silt was swirling away in clouds as the water rose. He was treading water now, catching an occasional foothold on a rock. He moved under the platform, beat at the pile with the axe head, then heaved it outward with all his strength. As the silt let go its hold, the pile swung upwards in the water and the platform sagged down at one corner. Instantly, 2 quags were in the water grasping the Mehaw pile and using it to restore balance. Carlyle swam to the diagonal under the far corner of the hut and knocked it out like a loose tooth. 2 more quags hove up out of the rain and balanced the platform. Carlyle knocked out the remaining leeward pile and felt the whole structure buckle and shift. He yelled to the quags and scrambled back onto the platform. The decking heaved about crazily. The last pile on the seaward side gave way. Carlyle watched his 2 pairs of assistants climb expertly inboard and tapped the loose piles free of their grooves as they rode up on the surface of the flood. Leaning down, he caught hold of one long pile as it clung to the side of the platform and shoved off from the island. The quags on deck gathered to help him, bracing their leathery underbodies against the pole. The platform shuddered, then settled gently. The wind was rising, and a strong current ran to the north. The Mehaw raft floated free upon the waste of waters. Carlyle and his deckhands carefully drew in their improvised oar. He felt an extraordinary sense of well-being as they clustered around his knees. The rain had slackened, but they still pressed forward into a wall of water. A gleam of violet penetrating the low ceiling of black cloud showed that the star was shining. Carlyle glanced down at the chief, who blinked solemnly through the rain. He remembered that he must answer the call signal and led the way into the Met hut. The quags had packed themselves in snugly under the big plastic dome. Carlyle couldn't think of any species who could carry off the situation better. Humans? Monkeys? Bedlam and filth. Okay, the quags were a spooky lot, and the smell, en masse, was like camphorated garlic, but there were times when he appreciated their stillness, the way they organized themselves. He lifted aside a tiny blue paw resting on the communicator and called the satellite. The signal was faint. "Readings." He gave the readings. "We observe dense cloud," pipped the signal. "Evaluate." Carl switched over to voice, although he didn't like talking to the computer. He made a report. The androgynous voice snapped. "Evacuate. Use life raft." Carlyle said, "The emergency is way past that point. I have evacuated the native population." The quags were vocalizing gently in the background. Quack, quack, quack. There was static. The voice signal was faint. "Follow emergency procedures. No record. Population. Save self data." Carlyle repeated stolidly, "Evacuating with quags." "Follow procedures. No deviation. Losing contact." Carlyle said coarsely, "Screw yourself, Tin Brain. Give me emergency voice contact." He slammed the red button, and Garrett answered. "Jim? Jim? What the hell is going on down there?" Carlyle gave his report all over again. The reply was broken and distant. "We're losing signal." Garrett was worried. "What in blazes are you doing with those quags?" "Evacuating them. The island is submerged by now, I guess." "But why? This is no time." "Tough luck. The quags. No ethnological value. Plenty more." "Hell," said Carlyle. "We cut down their tree." "Jim," cried Garrett, with the static closing in. "Take care. Crazy raft. Can't allow deviation emergency procedures." The receiver went dead. Carlyle felt a surge of panic, as if his lifeline had snapped. His morale sagged at the thought of the satellite. Warmth, filtered air, human company. He felt his conditioning slipping away. He was on the verge of apophobia. Weltraum Angst, the fear that grew in interstellar space from contemplating vast distances. He remembered poor Ed Kravitz, a cadet in his year who tried to cover up a bad case of yonders. He staggered through his classes on the station red-eyed and queasy. A glance at one of the monitors made him sweat. The checking of an airlock or a simple spacewalk left him shocked and pale. To see Kravitz struggling with a quantum equation was to apprehend the void, all the black miles that separated them from the tiny spinning globe of Earth, a pinpoint of light seen through the wrong end of a telescope. Carlyle dragged himself back to his own world. "Identify with the place you're in." Wasn't that Ava's way of saying it? Ava, E.M., Earth Mother, Commander Magnuson, come, beautiful Ava, aid me now. He sent his prayer off into deep space and doled out bacon cubes to all hands before striding out on deck. The rain had really eased off and the cloud was lifting. The Meehaw raft rushed on faster than before. With the current and a rising wind, they were making maybe 5 knots. The star was down. The brief blue night had settled on AC-14. The chief leaned on his knuckle pads beside Carlyle. They stared together over the wine-dark sea. Low waves came at the raft from the southwest as the winds swung around. They were long, uncrested hillocks of water that surged under the meehaw logs and disappeared into the dusk, rolling in line across the surface of the endless sea. "Those waves better keep low," said Carlyle. "Does the sea get rough?" In his 91 days of Met duty, he had never seen a choppy sea, never felt a drop of rain, never observed a significant crop in barometric pressure. He made wave motions with his hands, and the chief replied with "Awkee" and some new words. He thought of the sea rising up into roaring crests high over the raft, huge rollers, hills and valleys where the pink foam boiled. He had to shut his eyes to shake off the nightmare picture of those waves superimposed upon the harmless scene he was watching. "I better get some sleep," Carlyle muttered. He was wet and shaky, his morale still down. The whole project, the solitary Met duty, was a test of his survival qualities and his potential as a colonist. Perhaps he had blown it with Garrett by evacuating the quags. He stumbled back into the hut, found a way to his bunk, put on a fresh warm coverall from the thermopack. He didn't dare take any medication in case there was a sudden alert. Most of the quags were sleeping. He caught the gleam of an eye here and there, the flicker of a blue hand. The chief materialized at the foot of his bunk with two even more ancient creatures, so old that their skin was gray. They stared at Carlyle and clapped their long hands soundlessly. He felt an instant of revulsion, sleeping in a hut crammed with animals, for Christ's sake. Then, with a surge of weariness and a sense of strange well-being, he fell asleep. He was wide awake in a dark room with a low ceiling. A range of scents and sounds assailed him: fresh air, wood smoke, perfume, the waffling roar of a jet refueling, insects, someone idly keying a moog. Earth. He was on Earth. Carlyle knew that he must be dreaming. He savored his dream, taking in the outlines of the room. It was night. He was standing beside a window that opened onto a balcony. He glanced down at the thick, unpatterned carpet. A memory stirred. Had he been in this room before, or was it simply the color, a rippling mist green, an earth color? There was someone at the desk. Carlyle felt himself drift closer. He peered at the dark figure. A caftan, a long fall of dark hair. He couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. Yet something in the attitude of the head made him tremble in his dream. Slowly, Eva Magnusson turned until she saw him. She blinked into the darkness of the room, switched off her cassette, and removed the earpiece, as he had seen her do 1,000 times. "Jim?" Her voice was husky, hesitant. "Jim Carlyle? Ava?" In the dream, his own voice was muffled. "Where are you?" she asked. "Is this some kind of experiment?" "It's my dream," he said. "You know where I am. Jim, I can see you." "I thought of you," he said. "I have a situation going here. My communications are gone. No word from upstairs. Seeing you helps a lot." "You're not alone," she said. "Who are they?" "Quags," he said. "They're great little guys. You might find a short report on them in the file on AC-14. Not enough work done on quags." "You say you're sleeping?" "Sure. Ava, the sea is purple. Wine dark sea." "Oh, Jim." "Don't," he said. "Ava, don't cry. Think about what I said. I'm not one of your cadets anymore. We could take a colonial posting." Then, as she rose in her chair, the dream tilted. He was looking down on the room. He saw the figure of Ava Magnusson, his instructress, Commander Magnusson, M.D., specialist in space psychology, rise up from her chair and run forward on the green carpet. He felt an instant of amazement and fear. It was like watching something else, real life, not a dream. He heard Ava cry out across the abyss of space and time. Jim Carlyle, I love you. Then the dream vanished in a swirl of color and scent. He was back in the dark, in the flood, in the crowded Met hut, with the quags whistling in anxiety and the chief tugging his arm. Okay, said Carlyle. I see what's wrong. Rain was falling heavily again. The wind had become violent and ripped one of the panels out of the hut. The raft was bumping about in the water as the wind tore inside under the dome. I'll relax the panels, said Carlyle to the chief. I may need your team. The chief summoned them up in the eerie violet light of dawn, while the rest of the passengers cowered away from the driving rain. Carlyle went to work on the expanding ribs holding the panels. The hut began to fold down and the raft settled. Finally, he grappled with the damaged panel, but he had the order wrong. He had been too busy providing shelter for the quags. The torn panel should have been folded down first. He felt a thrill of warning. The eyes of the quags glowed around him. He shot up a hand and turned sideways. The heavy strut holding one side of the panel broke with a rending crack and came down on his head. Carlyle's last conscious thought was, I'm seeing stars. He was out, but not out cold for very long. He groped upwards towards consciousness through a fog of nausea and pain. Words whirled through the aching sunburst of his brain. He strove to move his legs, his hands, his fingers, to wrest open his leaden eyelids. He saw pictures, ragged scraps of film, the island, the satellite, a house in a green field. Where? He felt himself, flying, moving, uplifted, lifted by 100 strong blue hands. He could see them so clearly through his closed eyelids. Whoever had blue hands? He remembered and laughed in his pain-fringed dream. Their hands were blue, and they went to sea. They went to sea in a sieve. Carlyle opened his eyes. He was on his bunk, the quags all around him, their saucer eyes alight with concern. Concussion, mumbled Carlyle. Gotta take medication. He could not reach his head, but the chief guided his hand. There was a shallow 2-inch cut on his scalp above the left ear, and blood had soaked and matted his shaggy crop of hair, known in the service as the colonist's cut, or the Buffalo Bill. Must take antibiotic. Carlyle was heavily conditioned to protect himself against alien bacteria. He fought to stay conscious. Hogan, he whispered to the chief. Hogan, the medic, up there. He can tell me what to take. He sank into a confused nightmare of purple microbes and the capsules in his medical pack. Carlyle's head ached still, and he began this comical dream. He was in a cabin on the satellite, lying just above the floor, floating. It was some guy's bedroom, with his locker, pin-ups, a green video cassette. He heard startled voices and saw 2 people sitting up in the bunk, clutching the sheet around them. Hi, Mary, said Carlyle in his muffled dream voice. No clothes again. Carlyle? What the hell? It was Dick Hogan, the medic, naked too, and for some reason frightened. Hogan? Cried Carlyle. You're just the guy I wanted to see. Carlyle? Whispered Mary Long, the blonde anthropologist. Is it you, Jim? Sure, said Carlyle. I'm dreaming. I do a lot of dreaming down here. I have a concussion, Dick. A little cut on my scalp. The 2 lovers sat there petrified, unable to move. Carlyle laughed and could not make it out. He wasn't about to report them for fraternizing. "Come on now." He laughed, weakly. "What do I take, Dick?" "Not functioning too well. What antibiotic? The label." "UCF," said Hogan automatically. "You know that. Orange capsules." "Thanks." Then Mary Long pointed and began to scream. "Quogs! I can see quogs!" And the dream swirled away, taking Carlyle with it. After he got the chief to feed him the orange capsules, he slept long and heavily while his head mended. He woke at night out on deck with the raft still moving steadily in the grip of the current. They passed islands. No, not islands, but the tops of meehaw trees, and on the raft the quogs danced, holding out their hands to the distance, to their brothers in the dipping branches. He woke in the hut and saw a patch of indigo sky with the star shining down. Carlyle turned to the chief. He was still lightheaded. "Far and few," said Carlyle. "How does it go?" He struggled drowsily onto one elbow. "Few and far, far and few, are the lands where the Jumblies live. Their heads were green and their hands were blue, and they went to sea in a sieve." Carlyle was laughing, and the quogs waved their fingers. In his sleep, he heard someone calling his name. He woke up and found the chief vocalizing through his hands. "Kalai!" "Good try," said Carlyle, flexing his limbs and feeling stronger. He pointed to the chief, who slid across his nictitating eyelids in a show of quog bashfulness. "Tell me your name," urged Carlyle. The old quog boomed shyly. "Chief." Chief, the name Carlyle had given him, though he didn't recall ever calling him that, unless in his delirium. He let it go, puzzled. Either the quogs had no names, or they were like cats who had special sounds they used to communicate with humans. Carlyle checked his instrument. The stormy conditions were abating. A meehaw off to port showed a fraction of trunk. The floodwaters were beginning to recede. His chronometer told him he had been out of action for 3 days. The star hung low in a sky of aquamarine. He saw the plateau dead ahead, with the black cliffs rising up sheer. The current was no more than a ripple, and the meehaw raft moved sluggishly through the purple water. He checked the plateau through his glasses, trying to make out a possible landing place that he remembered, where broken columns of black basalt had made an alien giant's causeway. He saw a disturbance in the water, a line of foam. Before he could register it properly, he sensed the anxiety of the quogs growing into fear. Behind him they huddled and whistled, crowding into the ragged heap of the Met hut. He stood on the raft, sandwiched between two shock waves, the low wedge of foam moving towards them, and the almost palpable fear given off by the quogs. "What is it?" cried Carlyle. The chief, all of them, could give no answer, only this immense welling up of terror. Carlyle gazed at them blankly. A whale? A giant ray? The great horned toad? He pushed through the crowd and took down a regulation magnum. Then, as an afterthought, he reached down the new Fernlick, the automatic missile carbine. As he feathered its vents, he heard the sound, a high, vibrant scale of notes, swinging up and down on impossible frequencies. He might have heard it before, far out on the sea at night, so sweet and distant that it could be something he imagined. The quogs writhed in fear and pain, clasping their hands over their round ears, burrowing under the paraphernalia in the hut. Carlyle rushed out into the waves of strange music. The ripple had divided into 10, a dozen pink clumps of foam, approaching swiftly on all sides. He could almost see them now, not too large, dark shapes swimming easily, like seals, maybe, or dolphins, slipping, weaving, gliding just below the surface of the water. Carlyle squatted on the deck, fascinated. The music thrilled around him. His head sang. He felt dizzy. A young quag crouched at the doorway of the hut, rolled over, and died. Carlyle sprang up, gasping. With an audible pop, something reared up out of a patch of foam, a smooth pink bubble. At first, he thought incredulously of a child's toy space helmet. Then he saw that it was a bubble of foam. The bubble burst and a sleek black head appeared. It did look like a seal, but the coat was scaly, black crystalline scales, dark mother of pearl, breaking the bluish light into an alien spectrum. The creature was dancing on its tail, waving sleek webs like forepaws, only a few meters from the raft. Then, with a glissando of sound, infinitely sweet, like a peal of electronic bells, a single scaly tentacle whipped out from a curled position below the head and seized the body of the dead quag. The seal lizard flipped its catch into the air and caught it playfully. There was a flash of teeth, a minor chord. The quag's head was bitten off. A whistle of anguish rose from the burrowing, terrified quags crammed inside the hut. Carlyle shouted at the top of his voice. The creatures had never heard a human voice. There was an excited humming, a swish of dark bodies passing around and under the raft. A colony of pink bubbles grew to starboard at a safe distance. The seal lizards repeated what he recognized vaguely as the tone and pitch of his own voice. They boomed and cawed, bouncing about in the water. Carlyle accepted the invitation. He called again, telling them to clear off. The formation of bubbles began to move closer, tinkling, humming, testing. With a ringing head, Carlyle realized what they were trying to find. The raft was drifting closer to the plateau. He grasped the oar, still lying on deck, and began to drive the clumsy craft along. He would never escape this way before the seal lizards found his death frequency, the sound which would make this new creature with the harsh, loud voice fall down to be eaten. The seal lizards moved alongside in formation. The noise was unbearable. Carlyle sang, groaned, shouted aloud. A tentacle, then another, flicked over the timbers of the raft, plucked at his boots, probed towards the quags in the hut. Carlyle dropped his oar and fired the magnum in the air. The seal lizards hesitated, then pressed forward. A new wave of sound broke over the raft. He screamed and rolled upon the deck, pressing his hands over his ears. Through the mists of agonizing sound, he saw the seal lizards at the very edge of the boat, a row of neat, scaly black heads, narrow oval eyes, a structure of nasal beak and leathery appendages like whiskers. Even so close they looked amazingly like seals. He could not see how they made their music. Their comical mouths opened upon murderous fangs. A tentacle gripped his wrist and pulled gently. Roaring aloud to counteract their killing whine, Carlyle put one hand to the missile carbine and fired point-blank along the deck. A seal lizard was blasted into mush. The missile that destroyed it passed on across the sea, then struck and exploded, sending up a column of water 50 meters away. There was a moment of utter silence. Then the whole band of seal lizards dived like one creature. It could have been the shock wave that did it, or the sound of the carbine, or simply the death of one of their number. Rising to his knees, Carlyle saw them emerge far beyond the raft, swimming in formation, fast and low, a ripple bearing away to the southwest. He caught only a few notes of their music across the dark waters. The quags crept out and surrounded him, helping him to stand. Everyone, Carlyle included, was partially deaf from the encounter. The quags held their heads sideways and bounced on one leg, like a human bather with water in his ear. Carlyle shook hands with the chief. It caught on. The whole party, dizzy with relief, shook hands promiscuously. They were already within the shadow of the plateau. Carlyle and his crew, working the oar, struck a rock or a shoal, then another. They were over the flooded causeway where he had embarked for the island 3 months ago. He levered the raft in towards a rock platform. The quags had begun to stamp gently and hold out their hands to the plateau. One moment there was no sign of life, only the glittering plains of the great stone mesa. The next, every plain and slope was alive with quags. They spilled over the edge of the plateau in waves until the black rock was blanketed with brown and gray and tawny fur. A strange noise, stranger even than the music of the seal lizards, began to rise up from the multitude. They vocalized all together, by tens and hundreds, their weak voices blending into a vast, muffled shout that echoed out over the purple flood tide and reverberated from the chasms of the plateau. Ka-la-e! As his own quags pressed round him proudly, in silence, Carlyle recognized his own name. Then, as the shout redoubled, Ka-la-e! He saw himself as a new creature, as the quags perceived him, the clumsy, loud-voiced, white-handed giant of a new species, the dogged Ka-la-e, who made a marvelous craft from the looted remains of a meehaw tree, who overcame the flood, did battle with seal lizards, and brought a whole tribe to safety. The raft sidled into the platform, and a nylon rope fell on the deck. The quags were so thick that Carlyle had not seen the landing party, Garrett, Hogan, and Weiss. The sight of these men, his own kind, affected him powerfully. His sense of proportion was restored. He smiled and choked up, just as they all did. He felt as if he had returned from some other dimension, not a routine stint on AC-14. "Hey there!" cried Garrett. "Some welcome you got here, Lieutenant." "Am I glad to see you," said Carlyle. They heaved him ashore. The quags were whisked off the raft by hundreds of willing hands. Carlyle turned back to the chief. "See, the raft is made fast," he said. The men of the landing party turned back and watched as the chief and his offsiders tied up a pillar of rock. "Everything ship-shape," said Dick Hogan. "They know the ropes," said Carlyle. The party ascended through an aisle of quags, still hooting his name. Carlyle acknowledged the applause as modestly as he could. He was looking ahead eagerly. Yes, there was the landing module on the plateau, among the bushes and the stony burrows of the upland quags. He was going upstairs, back to the station. His limbs began to ache in anticipation of a steam bath and a bunk. "How's the head?" asked Hogan. "Oh, fine," said Carlyle. "It was just a simple concussion." Garrett turned to him. "You get it, don't you, Jim? You understand what you've discovered?" "I think so," said Carlyle. "I guess I knew all along, or when they called out my name. Did you know it was my name?" "We worked it out." They laughed and looked at Carlyle expectantly, waiting for him to bell the cat. "The quags are able to transmit pictures," said Carlyle. "They're natural telesends." "They're the first in the universe," said Garrett. "There's more to it than that, Max," said Carlyle. "Some kind of group intelligence." "They had us on the hop upstairs," put in Weiss. "What way?" asked Carlyle. "Reports of hallucinations," said Garrett. "Weiss here saw you on the raft. Hogan—" "I saw Hogan," said Carlyle. "Spoke to him. I thought it was a dream." He and Hogan exchanged glances, straight-faced. No one said a word about Mary Long. The Quaggs certainly had a trick of embarrassing that girl. "Communication can extend over vast distances," said Max Garrett. He was smiling in an odd way. The men were still watching Carlyle closely. He couldn't read much in their faces. No pictures came to him. For a moment he wished they were Quaggs. Hogan dug him in the ribs. "You got the prize, boy," he said. Garrett cleared his throat. "We had word. Commander Ava Magnuson put in a report. She'd also requested a PIC with Lieutenant Carlyle. A personal interplanetary communication. Something flashed from Earth to Armstrong Base to a chain of 100 satellites. It was the spaceman's version of compassionate leave. Marriages were contracted, births and deaths announced in this way. She's requested a colonial posting." Carlyle smiled foolishly, and the men all shook him by the hand. They were anxious to get him upstairs to sick bay, but Carlyle excused himself and turned aside. He bent down to the nearest Quagg. "Where's my friend, the chief?" There was an immediate response in the scattered groups of Quaggs returning up the sides of the plateau. A strong impulse, stronger perhaps because of the numbers involved, directed him to a low cave some distance away. He strode over and found the chief with his wives and children, being regaled with berries and limpets and sweet bark. He realized that he had been aware for some time that the chief was in fact a male. He found no difficulty in sexing Quaggs at a glance. The chief knew that he was leaving. "I'll come back after a few days," said Carlyle. The pair of them stood in a clear space, looking out from the height of the plateau. The 3 giant causeways in the rock were explained, 3 great chutes that drained off the deluge of rain from the high ground. The purple sea spread out beneath them. The meehaw trees marked the submerged islands. In a series of quick superimpositions, Carlyle saw the great day when the flood receded altogether, when the star approached its apogee and the islands became dry land again. "Yes," he said, "I'll be back to see that." As he turned to rejoin the landing party, Carlyle took in the scene. The 3 men beside their vehicle, tall visitors in regulation silver suits, and a 4th man, unkempt and hairy, in ragged coveralls, communing at a distance with the members of a new species. The men looked curiously towards Carlyle. Their anxiety did not quite diminish as he came closer. The distance between Carlyle and the landing party could not be taken up in a few small steps. They saw tomorrow's man, who, by some chance operation of goodwill, some accident of understanding, reached forward into new modes of being.